the obscure records of ancient tax collectors, counting grain, coin, and labor. When you think of ancient civilizations, you might imagine temples rising toward the sky, pyramids gleaming in the sun, or armies marching in tight formation across dusty plains. Yet behind these spectacles lay a quieter, more tedious foundation: taxes. Kings, emperors, and city councils could not build monuments or fund armies without a system to extract resources from ordinary people. And that system relied on the unglamorous work of tax collectors, scribes, clerks, and officials whose job was to keep track of grain, coin, livestock, and sometimes even labor itself. These collectors were not the heroes of history. They were often despised, sometimes feared, and frequently forgotten. Yet the records they left behind, lists of numbers carved into clay tablets, inked onto papyrus, or scratched on wax boards, are among the most valuable sources we have for understanding how ancient societies functioned. They reveal not only the mechanics of taxation, but also the rhythms of daily life, the burdens ordinary people carried, and the ways empires sustained themselves. Taxation as survival. In the ancient world, taxation was not a luxury. It was survival for rulers and for states. Armies required food, weapons, and wages. Temples required offerings and maintenance. Roads, canals, and fortifications needed laborers and materials. Without taxes, the machinery of government ground to a halt. Yet the forms of tax varied. In Egypt, much of taxation came in the form of grain. Each harvest, scribes measured fields, estimated yields, and recorded how much grain each farmer owed to the state. In Mesopotamia, records show a mix of barley, silver, and labor taxes. In Rome, citizens might pay in coin, but provinces often supplied resources in kind: cattle, wheat, or olive oil. To us, these records seem dry, long lists of names and amounts. But to the people of the time, they were instruments of power. A single missed entry could mean punishment. A favorable adjustment could mean survival through the winter. The scribes and their tools. The work of tax collection fell to scribes and clerks. These were literate men, sometimes priests, sometimes officials, who knew how to read, write, and calculate. Their tools were humble but effective. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with a reed stylus. The resulting cuneiform tablets were baked or left to dry, preserving records for millennia. Some tablets list nothing more than 2 sheep from so-and-so, for jars of oil from another. Yet they tell us who paid, what was valuable, and how resources were distributed. In Egypt, scribes used papyrus scrolls. Black ink recorded the accounts. Red ink highlighted totals or corrections. The surviving fragments sometimes show neat columns of grain deliveries, organized by village or household. The language is formulaic, but between the lines you can glimpse the bureaucracy at work. Men sitting in shaded offices, tallying sacks of wheat brought in from the Nile's fertile floodplain. In Rome, wax tablets were common. Officials wrote with styluses on wooden tablets coated in wax, erasing and rewriting as needed. For permanent records, parchment or stone inscriptions were used. The censor, a high-ranking official, oversaw the census, a grand survey of citizens and their property, forming the basis of taxation. Beneath him worked countless clerks whose names have not survived, though their scratches of ink and wax have. The weight of records. The sheer volume of records could be overwhelming. At archives in Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Nippur, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of tablets stacked together, many of them tax receipts. They are repetitive, even boring. 3 jars of beer, 2 goats, 5 baskets of barley. But together they form a portrait of an entire society's economy. In Ptolemaic Egypt, papyrus archives show how villages were organized into tax districts. Each official reported up a chain, ensuring that grain, oil, and linen flowed steadily toward state granaries and treasuries. Sometimes disputes broke out, and complaints were preserved in writing. Farmers insisting they had already paid, collectors accusing them of withholding. The monotony of these records mirrors the monotony of life. Taxes were not occasional, they were constant. Farmers sowed their fields knowing part of their harvest was already claimed. Merchants sold their wares knowing a portion was due to the state. Even labor itself could be taxed, measured in days of work on roads, canals, or military campaigns. The human burden. Behind the numbers lay human stories. A farmer whose crop failed might plead for remission. A widow might struggle to pay her family's dues. A village might pool resources to cover a neighbor's shortfall. Tax collectors themselves were not always powerful. In some societies, they were local men caught between the demands of the state and the resentment of their neighbors. Too harsh, and they risked rebellion. Too lenient, and they faced punishment from superiors. The position was precarious, often leading to corruption. Some collectors skimmed off grain or coin for themselves. Others forged records. Still others bribed higher officials to look the other way. And yet, despite corruption and resentment, the system endured. Taxes flowed upward, sustaining armies and temples, even as ordinary people grumbled. The collectors, anonymous in history, carried out the tedious work of empire. Archaeological glimpses. Today, historians treasure the records tax collectors left behind. Without them, much of ancient economic life would be invisible. A pyramid might tell us about royal ambition, but a papyrus roll tells us about how much grain a farmer in a small village harvested in a single year. A clay tablet might tell us how many sheep were collected for sacrifice at a temple, or how much silver was owed by a merchant family. In a sense, these obscure records bring us closer to ordinary people than any grand monument. They show us what mattered to the state, not just kings and battles, but the steady, measurable contributions of farmers, herders, craftsmen, and traders. Reflection. As you picture scribes hunched over tablets in dimly lit rooms, or farmers carrying sacks of grain to granaries, you begin to see the ancient world not as a story of heroes, but as a system of records. The empire was not only built in stone, but also in ink, clay, and wax. And yet, one cannot help but wonder. If so many records were kept, and so many lives measured in numbers, what happened to those who slipped between the lines? What about the debts unrecorded, the taxes unpaid, the lives lived outside the system of scribes and collectors? The machinery of ancient tax systems. When you imagine taxation in antiquity, you might think of a farmer handing over part of his crop, or a merchant paying a fee at the city gate. But behind each simple transaction lay an elaborate machinery of collection, auditing, storage, and redistribution. Taxes did not just flow upward by chance. They were organized, counted, weighed, and recounted. And for every farmer who brought in sacks of wheat or jars of oil, there was a scribe with a tablet, a storehouse clerk with a tally, and a supervisor comparing records to ensure no grain went missing. The story of ancient tax systems is therefore not one of drama, but of repetition. The same lists, the same tallies, the same rituals of weighing and recording were performed day after day, year after year. To understand the survival of empires, you must imagine not only kings and generals, but also auditors and warehouse managers, weighing and measuring. At the heart of taxation was measurement. The state demanded not just vague promises, but specific amounts. 30 baskets of barley, 5 jars of oil, 2 head of cattle. These quantities had to be measured and verified. In Mesopotamia, standardized weights made of stone or metal ensured that barley or silver could be measured consistently. Officials checked each delivery against these weights, inscribing the result on a tablet. In Egypt, measures of grain were recorded in heket, a unit based on baskets. Inspectors watched as farmers poured grain into measuring bins, leveling it off carefully to avoid disputes. The process was tedious. Imagine lines of farmers waiting at a granary, each carrying sacks of wheat. A scribe sits at a table, stylus in hand, while another clerk tips the grain into a measure, levels it, and notes the total. The farmer waits nervously, knowing that too little grain or too much spillage could bring punishment. Granaries and storehouses. Once collected, taxes in kind had to be stored. Grain was poured into massive state granaries, thick-walled mud brick or stone structures designed to keep out moisture and pests. Some were vast complexes with dozens of chambers, each locked and overseen by guards. In Egypt, granaries dotted the landscape of the Nile Valley. Papyrus records describe grain being tallied as it entered and left these storage sites. In Mesopotamia, granaries were often attached to temples, where offerings and taxes mingled in the same storerooms. For the clerks, the work was endless. Each delivery required a receipt. Each withdrawal required a record. Day after day, they inscribed figures. From so-and-so, 10 sacks. From another, 6 jars. To modern readers, these records appear monotonous, but to the state, they were vital. Grain in the granary meant soldiers could be fed, temple rituals could continue, and the city would endure through famine, audits, and double-checking. Of course, no system could survive on trust alone. Officials at higher levels audited the records of local collectors. They compared receipts with actual stock, checked tallies against reported figures, and punished discrepancies. In Ptolemaic Egypt, papyri show evidence of cross-checking. One scribe recording amounts at the granary, another recording them in the district office, and a third comparing both lists later. If numbers failed to match, an inquiry followed. Sometimes this was simple error. Sometimes it was fraud. Audits could be ruthless. Officials caught embezzling grain or silver faced severe penalties, fines, imprisonment, even death. Yet corruption was persistent. The sheer volume of resources moving through the system invited theft. Some collectors skimmed off the top, adding a little extra to their own storehouses. Others forged receipts, claiming more had been delivered than actually was. The cycle of audit and evasion was constant, a kind of cat-and-mouse game between collectors and overseers. Taxation and labor. Not all taxes came in the form of goods. In many societies, labor itself was taxed. Farmers were required to spend part of the year working on state projects, building canals in Mesopotamia, repairing dikes in Egypt, or constructing roads in Rome. These labor taxes were recorded just as carefully as grain or coin. Scribes kept lists of names, noting how many days each man worked. Failure to appear could mean fines or punishment. The monotony of digging canals or hauling stone was matched by the monotony of recording each absence and each completed task. Labor taxes bound communities together. A village might be required to send a certain number of men each season. Sometimes wealthier families paid substitutes to go in their place, turning labor into another form of exchange. But always, the records grew: lists of workers, lists of absentees, lists of substitutions. The burden of coin. By the classical period, especially in Greece and Rome, coinage became a more prominent medium of taxation. Citizens and subjects paid silver or bronze coins, which were easier to transport than sacks of grain. Yet even coin brought complications. Coins had to be weighed to ensure they were not clipped or debased. They had to be stored securely, often in temple treasuries or city arsenals. And once again, scribes recorded every transaction. Roman tax receipts carved in stone still survive, listing names and amounts paid. For ordinary people, coin taxes could be harder to bear than grain taxes. Grain could be grown and harvested. Coins had to be acquired through trade or labor. A farmer who owed coin might be forced to sell produce at unfavorable prices simply to obtain the necessary currency. Corruption and resistance. No matter the form of tax, corruption and resistance followed. Collectors were notorious for inflating dues, demanding bribes, or seizing more than required. In some societies, tax farming, a system where individuals paid the state in advance for the right to collect taxes, exacerbated the problem. Tax farmers were motivated to extract as much as possible to recover their investment and make a profit. In Rome, the publicani, or tax farmers, became infamous. Cicero and other writers complained of their abuses, especially in the provinces, where they squeezed subject peoples beyond endurance. Resistance flared in riots and revolts, though most protests were quieter: delayed payments, hidden crops, or quiet bribes to sympathetic officials. Yet despite resentment, the system endured. States needed revenue, and collectors, however corrupt, kept it flowing. For every complaint about injustice, there are thousands of routine receipts that show taxes being paid without incident. The daily monotony. If you picture a day in the life of an ancient tax office, it would be slow and repetitive. Clerks arrive with their tablets or scrolls. Farmers line up with goods to deliver. Each transaction is measured, recorded, and stamped. Later, the records are carried to a district office, where another clerk copies them into larger ledgers. At the end of the year, reports are sent to the capital, where yet another layer of officials compares numbers and issues decrees. The grandeur of empire was built on this monotony. Soldiers marched because clerks counted grain. Temples flourished because scribes balanced ledgers. Roads stretched across landscapes because peasants labored under recorded obligations. It is tempting to skip over these details, to focus on the monuments and the wars. But without the boring work of tax collectors, none of it would have been possible. Reflection. As you imagine rows of clay tablets stacked in a storeroom, or papyrus rolls piled in a dusty office, you begin to see the empire not in terms of marble and conquest, but in terms of lists and tallies. The power of kings and emperors rested not only on armies, but on the scribes who made sure the armies were fed. And yet, a question lingers. If so much depended on accurate records, what happened when records failed? When harvests were miscounted? When corruption ran rampant? Or when archives were destroyed? Did entire systems falter? Or did the sheer momentum of bureaucracy keep rolling forward despite its flaws? The consequences of taxation and the legacy of records. Taxes were more than numbers on clay or papyrus. They shaped the lives of ordinary people, determined the fate of empires, and often provoked unrest. If armies were sustained by taxes, so too were rebellions fueled by resentment of them. If temples and palaces rose through the steady flow of resources, villages sometimes collapsed under the burden of obligations they could not meet. The story of taxation is not only the story of administration, but also the story of consequences, of how boring records could trigger dramatic events. Resentment and resistance. In almost every ancient society, taxation was resented. Farmers who saw a portion of their grain carried off each harvest felt the weight of the state most directly. Merchants who handed over fees at city gates grumbled at the loss of profit. Shepherds whose flocks were counted feared being left with too few animals to sustain their families. Resistance took many forms. Sometimes it was passive, hiding part of a harvest, undercounting flocks, delaying payment. Sometimes it was more direct, riots against officials, or even rebellions against the state. In Egypt, records of complaints have survived, written in careful cursive on scraps of papyrus. Farmers wrote to officials insisting they had already delivered their quota, or that floods had ruined their crops. Some begged for leniency. Others accused collectors of corruption. Each letter is a reminder that behind the lists of numbers were human lives negotiating with an often inflexible system. In Rome, Taxation in the provinces could be brutal, especially under the publicani, the tax farmers who squeezed subject peoples to maximize their own profit. Cicero, in his speeches, complained of their abuses in Asia Minor. Revolts in places like Judea were stoked not only by religious and cultural tensions, but also by the crushing burden of tribute demanded by Rome. Revolts sparked by taxes. Sometimes resentment exploded into open revolt. In the Roman Empire, the Jewish revolt of 66 CE was fueled in part by anger at excessive taxation. In Egypt, periodic uprisings broke out when rural communities felt overburdened. Even in Mesopotamia, ancient tablets speak of cities refusing to send tribute, forcing kings to march out with armies to enforce payment. These revolts were rarely successful in the long run, but they reveal how taxation sat at the heart of state-society relations. To refuse taxes was to refuse the authority of the state itself. And so, empires defended their tax systems fiercely, for without them, the entire edifice of power could collapse. Strategies of survival. Ordinary people were not powerless. They developed strategies to manage their obligations. Some formed communal agreements, pooling resources so that no single household bore the burden alone. Others negotiated with local officials, offering bribes in exchange for favorable entries in the record books. Wealthier families sometimes purchased exemptions, shifting the load onto poorer neighbors. In Rome, citizens could appeal to higher magistrates for relief, though success depended on connections. In Egypt, petitions survive where entire villages begged for temporary exemptions after floods or locusts destroyed crops. Sometimes, officials granted leniency. Other times, they pressed demands regardless of circumstance. These strategies reveal a constant negotiation. Taxes were not simply imposed. They were contested, bargained, and adjusted. The records we have, petitions, complaints, adjustments, show the ongoing dialogue between rulers and ruled, even if the rulers held most of the power. The social role of records. What makes taxation particularly revealing is the sheer volume of documentation it produced. For every temple inscription celebrating a king's victory, there are dozens of tablets or papyri quietly recording taxes. These obscure records tell us more about daily life than grand monuments ever could. In Mesopotamia, entire archives of tax tablets survive, listing names of ordinary farmers and craftsmen otherwise lost to history. Without these records, we would never know their names. In Egypt, papyrus ledgers reveal how villages were organized, how much land each household farmed, and how harvests varied from year to year. In Rome, census rolls preserve the structure of society, showing who owned land, how much property they held, and where obligations fell. To modern historians, these records are a treasure. To the people who created them, they were tedious necessities. Yet it is the tedium that preserved reality. A farmer's crop, a merchant's debt, a widow's household, all scratched into documents that endured by chance. Archives and their fragility. One of the great ironies of tax records is that they were both enduring and fragile. Clay tablets, once dried, could survive for thousands of years, buried in ruins. Papyrus, however, decayed quickly unless preserved in the dry sands of Egypt. Wax tablets were easily erased and reused, leaving few permanent traces. Many archives were destroyed in war, burned by accident, or discarded when no longer useful. Yet the fragments that survive are enough to reconstruct entire systems. From these scraps, we can piece together tax structures, harvest yields, and the burdens placed on communities centuries ago. Sometimes the survival of records seems almost miraculous. In a ruined storeroom at Nippur, archaeologists found thousands of tablets buried under collapsed walls. In an abandoned village in Egypt, papyrus scraps stuffed into mummy wrappings preserved tax accounts otherwise lost. These chance survivals give us windows into worlds that would otherwise have vanished. Taxes as instruments of control. Beyond revenue, taxes were tools of control. By measuring fields, counting households, and tallying flocks, states asserted authority over their subjects. The census was not just about revenue. It was about knowing who lived where, who owned what, and who owed service. In Rome, the census defined citizenship itself. To be counted was to belong and to owe. In Egypt, scribes walking the fields embodied the state's reach into every village. In Mesopotamia, temple and palace archives symbolized the central power that demanded contributions from each household. The monotony of taxation masked its deeper role. It tied individuals to the state in ways both practical and symbolic. To appear in the records was to be recognized, even if recognition came with obligations. Reflection, the quiet power of lists. As you picture rows of scribes hunched over clay tablets, or papyrus ledgers stacked in dusty offices, it is worth remembering that the great monuments of history were sustained by these boring records. Without taxes, pyramids could not rise, armies could not march, and empires could not endure. And yet, the legacy of taxation is not only in monuments, but also in the records themselves. It is in the lists of names, the tallies of sheep and sacks of grain, the petitions and complaints. These fragments show us the humanity of the past more clearly than any temple wall. The paradox of ancient taxation is this. It was both resented and necessary, both tedious and essential. It sparked revolts and sustained empires. It oppressed individuals but preserved their existence in records that survive millennia later. So as you close your eyes and imagine the dim light of an ancient office, the scratch of a stylus on clay, or the rustle of papyrus under a scribe's hand, you might ask, what would have happened if those records had not survived? Would we still know these people, or would their lives, measured in taxes, have vanished entirely from history's memory?